I'm Tom Garreau of the Global Coral Reef Alliance. Around the world, global warming is causing hurricanes to greatly intensify in their strength. Kerry Emanuel of MIT has shown that for each 1 degree sea rise in temperature, the power of hurricanes increases by 7%. This last year in 2017, we had the strongest and the most hurricanes ever in the Caribbean. Many islands were totally devastated. One of the worst of these was Hurricane Irma, and this shows up a satellite image of Hurricane Irma when it was first approaching the Caribbean. Irma first slammed into Barbuda with such force that the entire population of the island had to be evacuated afterwards and still have not been allowed to go back months later. Right after Barbuda, the Category 5 hurricane hit into St. Bart's. That island was devastated, then St. Martin, then Tortola, and then a series of others. These hurricanes were fueled by the extreme high warm water in the western Atlantic. That's what made them so strong and so frequent. St. Bart's was devastated. This is the island of St. Bart's. Our location of our project is where the red X is. That's in a bay called St. Jean, which is the largest bay on the island, the largest beach. A close-up of St. Jean shows our location as the red X. The dark areas that you see is the old reef crest. The reason that beach is there in the first place is that there was an incredible, magnificent reef that grew almost all across the bay. That provided the sand that built the beach and protected that beach from washing away in waves. You can see the waves going across the reef crest. This reef, when it was alive, grew right up to the surface of the water. People could not swim over it because of the jagged coral. Almost all those corals died. Now to look at that area, it's a moonscape. This is a close-up of our site on the west side of the bay with the X. What you see is that this reef crest is really a third of a meter depth, or about a foot deep. The waves break onto it. They're constantly coming with the trade winds coming from the north, smashing onto that reef. A very powerful surge rushes over the reef, and that red X is in a channel that's about 1 meter deep on the bottom, or 3 feet deep, through which that water rushes. There's almost always a strong current. When Hurricane Irma hit, there were huge waves that smashed right onto this reef flat. We don't have measurements of that, but they were probably somewhere between 5 and 10 meters high, at least 20 or 30 feet. So there were immense waves. On the beach itself of St. Jean, all the houses and all the hotels along the beach were destroyed. Therefore, we expected that our BioRock Reef Restoration Project, sitting right where the waves were breaking, would also have been devastated. This is a photo of St. Jean Bay during the hurricane. You can see the flooding. This is the main coastal road around the island that's underwater. You see in the distance the breaking waves, and our location is behind those, or in those breaking waves that you see on the horizon, somewhat behind the hotel that you see on the left, which was destroyed by the hurricane. Our particular site is barren. You can see here the shallow water on top is only about a third of a meter, and it's essentially almost entirely dead coral. There are a few sort of weedy encrusting corals that you see that have settled there, but very few. It's about 1% or so live coral cover all along the top of that reef and the inside of the reef. See 1 or 2 corals here in the foreground, and this is rubble that has been thrown up over the reef crest by previous hurricanes, but it shows what all the area where we were growing our corals look like. The project is in front of the home of Dr. Nathalie Ledet. It's called the Project of Life, and it was the first project using BioRock for reef restoration St. Bart's, because locals were very concerned about the fact their reef was essentially dead and their beaches were eroding. This particular bay spends large amounts of money pumping sand onto that beach for tourism. It all washes away and they have to constantly repeat it. Therefore, we're trying to find a way to grow the reef faster to create more sand and protect the shore from erosion naturally without having to dredge sand. There was no electricity on St. Bart's for 2 months. Curiously enough, there was little or no damage to this site. This is the front of the house, where Dr. Ledet's house, and what you see here is the electrical cable that was powering with a very small trickle charge of current. To our amazement, that was completely intact after the hurricane. Here it is running across the rocks, and here are the corals we're growing. The structure itself is extremely simple. It's just a flat mesh on top of very shallow water, a very shallow bottom that's smashed by waves. And you can see the magnificent condition of the corals here. This is 2.5 months after the hurricane hit. The project had no power for 2 months, At this point, it's had power on for only 2 weeks after the hurricane. As you see here, there's no physical damage. This is the famous pillar coral. It's an iconic coral of St. Bart's. There's another pillar coral. These are very small fragments that we were growing. St. Bart's has more pillar corals than any part of the Caribbean I've seen. When the power came back on, the project began working immediately. There was no damage to the structure itself and no damage to the electrical cable, much to our surprise, despite the enormous waves that were breaking directly on the rocks and the fact that the electrical cable was simply lying on top of the rocks. Now we're going to look at video, 2.5 months after Hurricane Irma. As you see here, it's a very simple structure. The water was very shallow. We transplanted a handful of small fragments of coral. There were very few corals that we could find, naturally broken fragments to transplant. And as you can see, they've grown incredibly. Remember, this is 2.5 months after a Category 5 hurricane hit the spot with immense waves that broke right on top of it. This steel framework was literally lying on the bottom under its own weight, held down by rocks. In the period of time that it had been growing before the hurricane, it had grown so much limestone, it had cemented itself solidly to the bottom, it had cemented the rocks solidly onto the top so that none of them moved. What's more amazing is the condition of these corals. Look at them, there's no signs of breakage to them. It's hard to imagine. We expected that these would all have been devastated and broken and tossed away, but in fact, our corals look in perfect condition. They're healthy, they're growing beautifully. It's absolutely unbelievable. We never expected this sort of result. What it does show is that biorock reefs, if they're designed properly, can withstand the very strongest hurricanes on record. They produce such spectacular coral growth that we're able to restore them. You won't see any place else in this bay with this amount of acroporas. We have all the different species of Caribbean acroporas growing in high density here like mad. We're growing a whole new reef. What this also shows is that we can take barren reef flat that's eroding away and we can build it upwards faster than global sea level rise. Therefore, this is a new method that allows us to protect beaches that are eroding. Our goal in this project is to grow back all the dead coral reefs around St. Bart's, grow back the natural sand supply, grow back the natural protection of the shoreline, so that St. Bart's once again has healthy coral reefs, healthy fisheries, healthy beaches, and a sustainable tourism economy.